How long does it take science fiction to become just science? During a single year back in 1981, there were three landmark advances in technology and science fiction. A secret R&D effort called Project Chess released a new consumer electronics device into the market. Then a computer protocol was adopted that each and every one of us still uses today. And then finally, a little-known mathematics professor invented a whole new subgenre of sci-fi by publishing a story that predicted where those new technologies might take us in the future. It's been over 40 years now. Are we there yet? Welcome to Science Fiction Review, where we look at the history and the science of science fiction. I'm your host, Jim Dutton. The IBM PC, the Internet, and the sci-fi subgenre known as cyberpunk all emerged within the span of 1 year, the year 1981. Back then, most people did not have a computer in their homes, or in their offices, or certainly not in their pockets as we do now. In fact, unless you were at a university or worked at a computer company, you probably had never seen a computer. There were personal computers then, like the Apple II, and various hobbyist machines that ran an operating system called CP/M. But the choices were limited and they were expensive. The Apple machines were closed systems with limited software available to them. And only geeks who liked to program in assembly language generally owned CP/M machines. I had two, by the way. But in late 1980, the IBM Corporation, the company that sold these giant, expensive mainframe computers to large corporations, kicked off a weird project they called Project Chess in Boca Raton, Florida, of all places. And in August of 1981, they introduced a new, relatively inexpensive personal computer into the marketplace. Its official name was the IBM 50. Oh, hell, nobody remembers its official name because it immediately was dubbed the IBM PC, and that's how it's still known today. Now, the IBM PC was designed with an open architecture, unlike Apple's machines. Both the software and hardware could be built and integrated by third-party vendors. And that's exactly what happened. There was a proliferation of companies selling cool software for the PC. And also, since the hardware architecture was open, there were a bunch of PC clone companies making compatible machines that competed with IBM in the market. A confession time, I never actually bought an IBM PC. It was cheaper than a mainframe, obviously. I couldn't afford that at all. But it still cost something like $1,500 and more for software. And I was at grad school in 1981, so that was really kind of steep for my family's budget back then. So instead, I bought a PC clone from a little storefront in a strip mall in Austin. The name of that store was PCs Limited. When I went to pick it up, a skinny kid brought it out to me from the back of the store after I saw him making some final adjustments to the cabinetry using a rubber mallet. The kid's name was something like Michael Dell or something. I have no idea what became of that guy. But I actually bought one of his first computers when it was still called PCs Limited. Now, the IBM PC is a major reason that in-home computers grew to be such a big deal. Suddenly, everyone had a computer on their desk at home and in the office. But for a while, they were isolated devices with a hardwired set of peripherals. Computers couldn't talk yet amongst themselves. There was no way for my computer to speak to someone else's computer across the city. That is, unless you were lucky enough to be working for a major university or a government R&D lab. It happens that I did both of those things back then, so I got to use something called ARPANET, which was a geographically distributed network of computers sponsored by the U.S. government's Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency, or DARPA, which is a lot easier to say, by the way. I remember explaining to my wife how I could miraculously send electronic mail across the country in an instant. She asked me, why would anyone want to do that? And also, where do you put the stamp? She didn't really say that. The internet, as we know it today, didn't exist yet in 1981. Home PCs couldn't use ARPANET because it was a restricted government resource. You couldn't log on to ARPANET and do something unless you actually had a good reason to. And generally that meant a classified contract with the government. But there were many commercial and private networks available. Things like CompuServe and AOL, and you've probably heard those words before but have no idea and don't care what they actually meant. They were built on various underlying protocols, like X.25, for example. And you could connect your PC to one of those networks using something called a Hayes modem. Gosh, I love dating myself on all this stuff. The Hayes modem is the thing that made that weird sequence of beeps and squeaks that became famous in movies, announcing that you had connected to a network, usually AOL, because you had mail, of course. By the way, the Hayes modem was also introduced in 1981. It was a big year for technology. But computer networks were still disparate, competitive, and not at all interoperable. AOL didn't speak to CompuServe and didn't speak to all the other private and public networks that were out there, commercial networks that were out there. But that all began to change in late 1981 when the National Science Foundation, NSF, adopted a standard protocol for computers to use to talk to one another. That protocol was called the Transmission Control Protocol over Internet Protocol, also known as TCP/IP. When that happened, there were a few institutions that connected via this type of network through something called the NSF-Net, the National Science Foundation Network. The number of host computers on NSF-Net grew explosively after 1981, partly because of the success of that underlying protocol, that TCP/IP protocol. And so NSF-Net grew and eventually became the internet. And today, 65% of Earth's population are internet users, and there are over 1 billion computers connected to it. The inventors of TCP/IP, Vint Cerf and Bob Kahn, won a Turing Award, which is the Nobel Prize in computing, for inventing the most popular network protocol in the world. So that's a lot of science and very little fiction so far in this discussion. What if you had been around when all of these things were changing so rapidly back in 1981? What would you have imagined the future might look like? A mathematics professor at San Diego State University named Werner Vinge answered that question by writing an amazing sci-fi story entitled True Names. It's a bizarre tale where everybody owns a personal computer. They're all connected together, forming a fully immersive virtual reality called the other plane. This VR space is populated by a cabal of hackers called warlocks, whose great adversary is the government of the United States. The protagonists of the stories are characters with very strange names like Mr. Slippery and the Mailman. Vince's story is prescient in a number of ways, not least of which is the ubiquity and importance of using fake names within the other plane. In fact, the most important principle for Mr. Slippery and the other warlocks is that they must protect at all costs their true names. Otherwise, if the great adversary were to discover who they are, they and their families would likely suffer true death in the real life. The protagonists are hackers, a pejorative term. They were bad guys, anti-heroes. The original mission of the warlocks was to break into computers and vandalize them, stealing data. They were, to use another pejorative term, punks. Vinge's story was influential in defining this new cyberpunk subgenre of science fiction. Later, other authors like William Gibson and Neal Stephenson took those basic ideas and those basic feelings and imagined their own worlds populated by online anti-heroes. So, Here we are, 40 years after all of this happened. Was Vinci right in his predictions about online virtual spaces, cyberpunks, and the importance of pseudonymous identities? The future Vinci imagined is getting close to becoming reality, at least in my opinion. Mark Zuckerberg invented an internet dating app way back when that made him one of the wealthiest people on Earth. But Facebook didn't allow for the use of pseudonyms, instead insisting on some undefined or poorly defined thing called authenticity. It sounds a lot like true names to me, but he decided to go that path. Also recently, Zuckerberg named his business empire Metaverse, using a term coined by Neil Stephenson in his cyberpunk novel Snow Crash. Also, there's Twitter. Twitter famously does allow the use of fake names and fake identities. It has become perhaps the most influential source of information, both good and bad, in the world. And it has its own menagerie of troublemakers and warlocks, including at least one character for whom the name Mr. Slippery would be entirely apt, probably. But we're not quite there. We don't yet have that immersive 3D shared virtual space imagined by Dr. Vinci. Zuckerberg has recently even abandoned his efforts to market such a thing before it actually exists. I personally believe that the reason we don't have it yet is that we don't really need it. There might be no good reason to simulate physicality in an intrinsically non-physical universe. In any case, Vinci's story of warlocks and avatars and other cyberpunk adventures that follow that story, gave us a glimpse into where our rapidly advancing technology might take us, and what dangers may wait for us there. I do believe that we technologists have probably ignored some of the lessons we might have learned from those fictional but prescient sci-fi imaginings. I mean, great sci-fi isn't just about entertainment. It's a way of designing the future. It's perhaps the only way for humanity to stay ahead of the tidal wave of new science and technology that crashes into our personal and social frameworks with increasing force and speed. Later on in 1993, Werner Vinci wrote a nonfiction essay that he presented at a conference for NASA. The first line of that essay makes a frightening prediction about something he called the technological singularity. Here's what he said. Within 30 years, we will have the technological means to create superhuman intelligence. Shortly after, the human era will be ended. So again, I ask you, are we there yet?